answer. Why? But the same thing that brought me the greatest unease also brought me the greatest gift. These families, the loved ones left behind, occasionally have shared their perspectives and thoughts, and sometimes dreams, visions, and synchronicities that they experienced in and around the death of their loved one. These reflections have made me wonder. When I was growing up and didn't understand a problem or an issue, I would often talk with my father and be told to study harder. Applying this wisdom, I began to study the issue of death, loss, and mortality from every angle I could imagine. It's been written that if you look at something closely enough, you begin to see right through it. I have come to believe that the answers to life's most difficult questions are woven into its design, much like an optical illusion. First, you have to be looking, and when you look closely enough, something happens. A tiny shift in perspective occurs. Images once hidden become apparent, and you can't help but wonder what changed and why you didn't recognize them before. I've come to realize that there is a mysterious dimension of forensic pathology that I almost missed entirely, and yet it also feels strangely familiar. Although I still document the body of evidence, I've become fascinated with the essence of what has left. For a scientist and physician, however, the problem is that this area of study isn't precise. It can't be measured or photographed, and people's experiences around death can't be proven beyond a reasonable degree of medical certainty. Studying death has required me to take a leap, a huge leap professionally, from my mind to my heart. And in doing so, I've remembered that what is most meaningful often cannot be measured, and that everything that counts cannot be counted. Individually, these experiences and shared stories were interesting, but collectively they had the ring of a larger truth. Almost unexpectedly, as I gathered and wrote down these stories, I realized that the answers I'd been searching for had been there all along. They were woven into the fabric of my patients' lives and deaths, and woven into my own. I just hadn't recognized it. So to answer my mother's first question, I realize now that I wrote this book for myself. You see, I believe that we teach that which we need most to learn, and I now know that we teach that which we need most to remember. That, perhaps, is the greatest revelation for me. The answers were there all along. I just had to remember them. The answer to the second question, why, is still unfolding, but it is beginning to be replaced with wonder and inklings of greater things to come. The search has led me on an unexpected journey, and I've encountered some treasures along the way. I've grown much more aware of the divine presence in the universe than I ever imagined I would be. I remember more often to see magic unfolding in my life. I've begun to trust that I'm never alone. I have come to believe that our loved ones are truly forever ours. It has been said that what you do for another, you ultimately do for yourself. These gathered experiences and recounted stories have been a blessing in my life. It is my fondest hope that their telling will be a blessing in yours. The first house call. I grew up watching my father care for people, attempt to heal them and comfort them. I grew up watching my mother lovingly care for Dad and for us. My father is a doctor and my mother a nurse. They met for the first time over the bed of a sick child on Station 42, the pediatrics ward at the University of Minnesota Hospitals in Minneapolis. Dad tells me that he knew in an instant that this pretty little Irish woman would one day be his wife. 3 years later, in the midst of his internal medicine internship and World War II, they married, and he went off to war. They wrote to each other every day. My mother has kept those love letters close to her heart all these years, carefully wrapped and stored with other treasures in her cedar chest. When my father returned from his tour of duty at a Navy hospital in the Pacific, my mother stopped working as a private duty nurse, and they began raising their family. I am the oldest of 3 children. I knew very early in my life that I would be a doctor. Or a cowboy. My mother first convinced me that I was a girl, and then that if I became a doctor, I might be able to afford to be a cowgirl. Dad practiced medicine in the days before managed health care, when house calls were not uncommon, and he never seemed to mind them. When I was a little girl, my father would take me and my siblings along on house calls. I loved to go, but Dad would have my brother and me wait in the car while he went in to care for the sick. I often wondered just exactly what Dad did when he visited his patients, many of whom were our neighbors. My mother tells me that while we were waiting in the car one windy day, Dad came out of a house to find that I had taken a whole box of tissues and let them go one by one out the car window. All the lawns down the block were strewn with flowered white tissues. Dad spent the next half hour picking them up. After that, I never played with the tissues again, and I began making house calls too. These visits fascinated me. Even then, I was aware that Dad seemed to be able to fix things. I would see looks of concern and worry melt into smiles and thank yous. These people seemed to just love my Dad. It was amazing. I knew even then that part of the magic that surrounded my father was his great compassion and his ability to gently reassure his patients. And I know now that Dad reassured us all. My father's doctor bag was made of smooth tan-brown leather. It had many compartments and smelled of antiseptics and leather polish. His stethoscope and blood pressure cuff were nestled among papers and syringes and vials. I would often carry his bag as far as the patient's front door. One day I went with my father to visit Mr. Phillips, an elderly neighbor who lived with his wife across the street from us. Their white house was filled with dark furniture, embroidered chairs, and heavy drapery. The house smelled of old things and perfume. Mrs. Phillips must have been watching for us, because the front door opened before we had climbed to the top step. She thanked Dad for coming to their home and held on to his hand as she told him about her husband, who'd been sick for a long time. Dad put down his doctor's bag, took off his coat, and placed it on a hallway chair. "Don't worry now, Irene. Let me go and see him. Janis, you wait here for me," he said as he gestured to one of the living room chairs. Mrs. Phillips took Dad and his bag down the short, dark hallway just off the living room and opened a partly closed bedroom door. She came out a few minutes later. She looked calmer now. "Would you like some milk or lemonade?" she asked me. "Yes," I nodded as we walked into the kitchen and I sat down at the table. How different their kitchen looked from my mother's. There was so much stuff on the counters, little bags of this and that, cookies and crackers, jams and nuts, and books everywhere. Mr. Phillips was a teacher. She placed a glass of cold milk and a plate of cookies in front of me. "How is Mr. Phillips?" I asked. "He's very sick," she answered. "I'm so glad that your father is here to help him." She picked up an armload of towels from the floor. "Will you be all right here for a few minutes? I have to run downstairs for a moment to change a load of wash." I nodded, and Mrs. Phillips disappeared down a long, narrow set of stairs to the basement. I looked around, then quietly got off the chair and stole through the living room and down the hall to Mr. Phillips' bedroom. I peeked through a crack in the door. Mr. Phillips was sitting up in bed. His shirt was off, and Dad was thoughtfully listening to his chest, telling him to take a deep breath. Then Dad sat down beside the bed as Mr. Phillips put his shirt back on. I saw Dad nod his head as Mr. Phillips began to speak. Then, to my surprise, I saw Mr. Phillips put his big gnarled hand up to his eyes and begin to cry. They were great big sobs. His shoulders shook and his head was bowed. Dad gently reached over and put his hand on Mr. Phillips' arm, and then took his hand and held it in both of his. Neither talked for a while. Mr. Phillips looked very old and bony just then, his skin thin and wrinkled. He seemed to all but disappear beneath the bedsheets. He and Dad sat there for a long time, it seemed, and then Mr. Phillips slowly stopped crying, reached over to Dad and hugged him. As Dad stood up, I saw that he had tears in his eyes, too. That was the first time I saw my father cry. Then I heard a noise and quickly ran back to the kitchen, gulped down the glass of milk, and hid a cookie in my pocket, just in time, as Mrs. Phillips was carrying a basket of clothes up from the basement. Dad spoke to her as we put on our coats.